For decades, the United States was the unavoidable middleman in the flow of goods between Canada and Mexico. If you were shipping auto parts from Ontario to factories in Monterey, your freight passed through U.S. territory. If you were exporting wheat from Saskatchewan to Mexican mills, the most cost-effective route was through U.S. rail systems and ports. The U.S. collected tariff revenue.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Controlled inspections, and wielded that power as a form of leverage in every trade negotiation. That grip is loosening fast. The Northern Corridor, the new spine of North America. Canada and Mexico aren't just tweaking trade routes. They are building an entirely new spine for continental commerce. The Northern Corridor, stretching over 9,200 kilometers and deliberately bypassing the United States. At its core, the Northern Corridor is both a logistical network and a political statement. The railways, highways, upgraded ports, and even digital customs systems are designed to connect Canadian industry directly to Mexican consumers and manufacturers without paying a cent to U.S. customs or subjecting goods to American inspections. Billions, over $120 billion, are being poured into rail expansions from Vancouver and Prince Rupert down to Mexican Pacific ports like Mazatlan and Lázaro Cárdenas. These ports are being upgraded to handle larger cargo ships than many U.S. West Coast facilities can currently manage. New rail routes cut through the Rockies, link to the Canadian prairies, and snake down into Mexico via a combination of Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CPKC, tracks, and newly constructed high-speed freight corridors. And they're not stopping at physical infrastructure. Blockchain-based customs clearance and smart contracts are being integrated into the system, meaning goods can clear borders digitally in minutes, without the delays or unpredictability that shippers have long endured at U.S. ports of entry. Why this is happening now? To understand the urgency behind the Northern Corridor, you have to look at recent U.S. policy moves. Tariffs have become Washington's blunt instrument of choice, justified under national security or protecting American jobs. Under both Trump's first administration and his current term, tariffs were imposed on a wide range of goods from Mexico, Canada, the EU, and Asia. For Canada and Mexico, who together make up America's two largest trading partners, the message was clear. U.S. trade policy could turn hostile overnight, regardless of previous agreements. Why keep your supply chains tied to a partner who might weaponize customs inspections or tariffs the next time there's a political dispute? The Northern Corridor is the insurance policy. It's also the escape hatch. Economic shockwaves for the U.S. If the Northern Corridor fulfills even half its potential, U.S. ports and customs stations will lose a massive share of transcontinental cargo. Right now, a significant percentage of Canadian goods headed to Mexico, and vice versa, pass through U.S. infrastructure. Those shipments generate tariffs, inspection fees, and a steady stream of business for American trucking companies, rail operators, and service providers. Analysts estimate that bypassing U.S. territory could strip as much as $245 billion in economic output from the American economy over the next 5 years. That's not just lost federal revenue. It's lost jobs for American dock workers, longshoremen, warehouse operators, and rail crews. Industries dependent on North American integration will also feel the pinch. U.S.-based auto plants that rely on just-in-time deliveries of parts from Canada or Mexico may see delays and increased costs if suppliers reroute to the Northern Corridor to avoid U.S. tariffs or inspections. The steel and aluminum sectors, already battered by shifting trade policies, could lose their competitive edge as Canadian and Mexican producers strengthen ties with Asian and European buyers via this new network. The political symbolism. This is more than a trade route. It's a diplomatic message painted across the map of North America. We don't need the U.S. to trade with each other. For decades, the assumption was that the U.S. sat at the center of the North American economy, both geographically and politically. The Northern Corridor challenges that assumption directly. It says that geography can be re-engineered with infrastructure and that political dominance is not a permanent fact of life. In some ways, it's a reversal of NAFTA's original spirit, When NAFTA launched in 1994, it was about binding the three economies together more tightly, with the U.S. naturally in the lead. Now, the U.S.'s former partners are binding themselves more tightly to each other, with the U.S. intentionally excluded from the equation. The technology factor, digital trade without the U.S. One of the most underappreciated parts of the Northern Corridor is its embrace of digital customs processing. By integrating blockchain-based tracking, electronic bills of lading, and automated tariff payments, Canada and Mexico are removing one of the biggest advantages the U.S. historically had: established trade infrastructure. For decades, the argument was, sure, the U.S. charges fees, but our systems are the most efficient. That's no longer true. The Northern Corridor's technology will allow trucks and trains to cross the Canadian-Mexican border in hours instead of days. Cargo tracking will be visible in real time for buyers and sellers on both ends. That speed means lower costs, fewer delays, and, crucially, no exposure to U.S. policy swings. Who gains? Who loses? Winners. Canadian exporters in agriculture, energy, and manufacturing, who gain faster access to Mexican markets without tariff uncertainty. Mexican manufacturers in automotive, electronics, and textiles, who can import Canadian raw materials and components more cheaply. Asian and European trading partners, who can plug into this corridor via Canadian and Mexican Pacific ports, avoiding U.S. entry points entirely. Losers. U.S. port cities like Los Angeles, Long Beach, Seattle, and Houston, which will see less cargo volume. American logistics firms that have built their business models around being the unavoidable bridge between Canada and Mexico. U.S. manufacturing hubs that could face higher costs and slower supply chains if trade flows bypass them. The risk of contagion. If the Northern Corridor succeeds, it sets a precedent. Other regions could replicate the model, creating new trade clubs that deliberately sidestep U.S. oversight. Already, discussions are quietly happening between South American and Asian nations about building direct links that avoid U.S.-controlled shipping lanes and financial systems. The lesson they're taking from Canada and Mexico is simple. If the U.S. can use its dominance to impose costs, then the safest move is to design a system where the U.S. has no choke points. Washington's dilemma. This puts the U.S. in a difficult position. Does it double down on tariffs and protectionism, risking further isolation? Or does it step back, lower trade barriers, and work to restore trust with its closest neighbors? The political climate makes the latter difficult. Tariffs are popular with certain domestic industries and voters, even when economists warn of long-term damage. Backtracking could be seen as political weakness. But maintaining the current course risks turning the Northern Corridor into a permanent fixture, one that younger generations of Canadian and Mexican business leaders grow up treating as the default, leaving the U.S. permanently out of the loop. The long-term consequences. If the U.S. loses its central role in North American trade, the effects will ripple beyond economics. Influence in regional politics often follows trade routes. The U.S. has long leveraged its role as a trade hub to shape policies on security, immigration, environmental standards, and labor rights across the continent. With Canada and Mexico building an independent system, the U.S. will have far less leverage to push its agenda. And as other nations plug into the corridor, they'll be aligning themselves more closely with Ottawa and Mexico City than with Washington. This is how geopolitical influence erodes. Not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow redirection of money, goods, and relationships. Right now, the Northern Corridor is still being built. There's time for the U.S. to reassert its role, but that window is closing fast. Every kilometer of track laid, every port expansion completed, and every digital customs checkpoint tested is another step toward North America, where the U.S. is no longer the center of gravity. The question isn't just whether Washington will act. It's whether anyone in power truly understands that this isn't just about tariffs or trade revenue. It's about whether the U.S. will still be the backbone of the continent's economy, or just another neighbor watching the trains go by. One of the most underdiscussed aspects of the Northern Corridor's emergence is how it's reshaping corporate decision-making inside Canada and Mexico. For decades, manufacturers in both countries built their supply chains under the assumption that U.S. transit was a given. Warehouse locations, production schedules, Even staffing patterns in factories were tied to the idea that goods would move through U.S. territory and infrastructure. Now, those same companies are running entirely new models. They're asking, if we can bypass U.S. delays and tariff unpredictability, should we redesign the whole system? And the answer, increasingly, is yes. That means Canadian companies that once had distribution centers in Chicago or Detroit are quietly shutting them down and shifting to storage hubs in Mexico's industrial belt. Mexican firms that relied on U.S. customs brokers are now hiring Canadian-based logistics tech firms. This isn't just about moving goods differently. It's about erasing dependencies that were once thought permanent. The cultural shift in business relationships. There's also a cultural change happening between Canada and Mexico. Historically, trade between them often felt like a secondary channel, with the U.S. as a main partner for both. The Northern Corridor is forcing direct engagement. Canadian agricultural exporters are building relationships with Mexican wholesalers without a U.S. intermediary. Mexican auto parts manufacturers are meeting Canadian assembly plant managers face-to-face, skipping the middle step entirely. That direct contact creates trust. Trust becomes long-term contracts. And long-term contracts form the backbone of supply chain resilience. This is something the U.S. cannot easily undo. Because once trust is built and contracts are locked, companies are reluctant to return to older, riskier systems. The labor market disruption in the U.S. At home, the impact on U.S. labor is beginning to take shape in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Port workers on the West Coast are seeing fewer shifts. Rail freight operators in Texas and the Midwest are being told to expect lower volumes next year. Customs brokers, who spent entire careers navigating U.S. paperwork for cross-border shipments, are quietly being laid off as their clients opt for routes that skip the U.S. altogether. These aren't just numbers in an economic report. They're mortgages at risk, college savings accounts drained, and retirements delayed. For families in port cities, a shift in trade routes doesn't feel like geopolitics. It feels like an eviction notice, insurance, risk, and investor confidence. One of the more technical but critical points here is the way global insurers and investors are reading the Northern Corridor. For years, insuring cargo through the U.S. meant predictable timelines, relatively low political risk, and protection of the largest economy in the world. But political risk isn't just about war or piracy. It's about the policy volatility that can disrupt business overnight. By creating a direct Canada-Mexico route, shippers reduce their exposure to sudden tariff hikes or politically motivated customs slowdowns. Investors like predictability. The Northern Corridor offers it, and that makes it a magnet for capital investment. Capital that, in another era, would have gone to expanding U.S. ports or logistics hubs. Energy and resource flow realignment. It's not just manufactured goods that are moving differently. It's energy and raw materials. Canadian oil, natural gas, and minerals like lithium are increasingly being contracted for shipment to Mexico's ports, where they can either feed Mexican industry or be exported to Asia and Europe without passing through U.S. pipelines or refineries. For the U.S., that means less influence over where and how North America's critical resources are sold. It also means potential loss of bargaining power in global energy markets, where control over transit routes often equals leverage in negotiations. The rise of regional identity. The corridor isn't just an economic project. It's also fueling a sense of regional identity between Canada and Mexico that didn't exist in this way before. Governments are holding joint infrastructure summits. Universities in both countries are establishing exchange programs for logistics, engineering, and trade law. Think about that for a moment. Future trade lawyers in Mexico will be trained to navigate Canadian regulations, not U.S. ones. Future Canadian engineers will specialize in Mexican port infrastructure, not Californian or Texan ports. Over a generation, that shapes not only economies, but also political alignments. The missed opportunity for U.S. innovation. One of the tragedies here is that the U.S. could have led this transformation rather than being cut out of it. Imagine if Washington had proposed a trilateral high-speed freight network that linked Vancouver, Dallas, and Mexico City, with the U.S. as a digital and physical backbone. Instead, tariffs and distrust became the accelerants for an alternative vision, one where American infrastructure wasn't even in the blueprint. The Northern Corridor's focus on blockchain custom systems, AI-powered logistics planning, and climate-resilient transport infrastructure could have been pioneered under a U.S.-led plan. Instead, those innovations are being funded and tested without U.S. involvement. That loss of first-mover advantage is something that may haunt American competitiveness for decades. Consumer-level consequences. It's tempting to think all this is abstract, but there's a retail-level impact too. U.S. consumers may start seeing higher prices for Canadian and Mexican goods, from fresh produce to auto parts, because those goods will no longer be just passing through on U.S. routes that incidentally allow for domestic offloading. If Canadian beef ships straight to Mexico rather than passing through U.S. processors, American buyers lose access to certain quantities, and the ones they can get may be more expensive. If Mexican electronics are loaded directly onto Asia-bound vessels in Mazatlan instead of California, they won't trickle into U.S. markets at the same price point. The risk of strategic isolation. The bigger danger here is that the Northern Corridor is part of a pattern. The U.S. is slowly being designed out of other nations' critical infrastructure. In shipping, finance, energy, and now overland freight, workarounds to U.S. dominance are multiplying. In the short term, Washington may frame this as other countries' loss. But in the long term, losing the ability to set the rules is what diminishes superpowers. Once countries get used to operating without U.S. systems, there's no incentive to go back. Where this could lead in 10 years. Project forward a decade. If the Northern Corridor becomes a default route between Canada and Mexico, we could see other Latin American nations, like Chile, Colombia, or Brazil, joining the network through port agreements in Mexico. That would create a Pan-American trade bloc, where the U.S. is literally off the map. Meanwhile, U.S. exporters might find themselves paying to enter the very system they once dominated, applying for corridor access, negotiating with foreign customs authorities, and following rules they had no part in writing. That's the quiet revolution here. Not just bypassing U.S. soil, but bypassing U.S. rulemaking. And once that's gone, getting it back would take more than infrastructure investment. It would take decades of rebuilding. If you strip away the policy jargon and trade statistics, what's really happening is a loss of control over the narrative. For decades, the U.S. didn't just dominate trade routes. It set the tone for how trade was imagined in North America. Washington's message to the world was simple. If you want to succeed in this market, you pass through us. The Northern Corridor tells a different story. It says to Canada and Mexico, you can succeed without Washington's blessing. And the most dangerous part? That message is starting to stick. The psychological shift for American influence. Economic losses are tangible. You can measure them in GDP points and job cuts, but influence is harder to quantify. When U.S. policymakers call Ottawa or Mexico City in the future to push for a certain standard or regulation, those governments may feel emboldened to say, we don't have to. Not out of hostility, but simply because the leverage that once existed isn't there anymore. And once that psychological barrier is broken, it rarely gets rebuilt. The U.S. risks being seen not as the indispensable partner, but as an optional partner. For a country that has spent the last century defining itself as the anchor of the Western Hemisphere, that's more than an economic wound. It's an identity crisis. Ports left behind. The hardest hit victims of this shift won't be think tanks in Washington or executives in boardrooms. It'll be the port cities whose economies depend on high-volume freight traffic. In places like Laredo, Texas, and Long Beach, California, the reduction in shipments is already sparking concerns in local councils. Property tax revenue tied to logistics businesses is dipping. Hotels and restaurants that cater to freight crews are reporting fewer bookings. For these cities, the Northern Corridor isn't an abstract geopolitical project. It's a drain on daily life. Every container that moves through Mazatlan instead of Los Angeles is money not spent in the local economy. Every rail car rerouted to bypass U.S. inspection stations means fewer shifts for union workers. Some of these cities are already debating whether to offer new subsidies or tax breaks just to lure any type of cargo business back. That kind of desperation is the opposite of the dominance the U.S. once enjoyed in this sector, the technology leapfrog. Then there's the tech dimension. The Northern Corridor is integrating blockchain-based customs tracking, automated port cranes, and AI-driven logistics planning from day one. By contrast, many U.S. systems are still reliant on legacy software patched together over decades. If Canada and Mexico build a trade route that's not only cheaper but technologically smoother, shippers will gravitate toward it naturally. Over time, those systems have become the new standard, forcing the U.S. to either adapt to them or risk being left out entirely. Here's the kicker. Adopting someone else's system means surrendering control over the data it generates. For the U.S., losing access to granular trade flow data in its own hemisphere will be a blow not just to economic planning, but to national security. The political domino effect. Geopolitics rarely moves in isolation. If the Northern Corridor proves itself, other nations will take note. Imagine if Brazil and Argentina begin exploring a southern corridor that links directly into Mexico's ports, cutting the U.S. out of agricultural exports. Or if Caribbean nations shift their shipping hubs to integrate with this new network instead of Florida's ports. Suddenly, you're not looking at one bypass. You're looking at a parallel trade architecture forming in the Western Hemisphere. And once multiple bypasses exist, the U.S. no longer sits at the center of the map. That's not just a logistical change. It's a political one. Trade route shape alliances. If nations build together, they tend to vote together in international forums, sign defense pacts, and coordinate on foreign policy. The U.S. risks watching its own neighborhood slowly tilt away from its influence. Domestic politics will feel the heat. The domestic conversation around this will get ugly. Protectionists will argue that doubling down on tariffs and America First measures is the only way to regain leverage. Free traders will warn that such policies are precisely what pushed Canada and Mexico into each other's arms in the first place. And in the middle will be voters in port cities, factory towns, and transport hubs, people whose livelihoods are directly threatened by the shift. They may not care about the geopolitics, but they'll want solutions fast. That pressure could fracture political coalitions and create new fault lines in U.S. politics. Not left versus right, but globalist versus regionalist, or even integrationist versus isolationist. Canada and Mexico's newfound leverage. It's worth noting that Canada and Mexico aren't just reacting here. They're seizing the chance to play offense. With the corridor giving them more negotiating power, they can push for trade agreements with Europe, Asia, and Latin America that sidestep U.S. terms entirely. That means if the U.S. wants to sell into those networks, it will have to accept the conditions Canada and Mexico negotiate. It's a subtle but profound role reversal, the rule maker becoming the rule taker. The risk of cultural drift. Trade is never just about goods. It's also about the flow of ideas, culture, and people. When Canadian and Mexican supply chains bypass the U.S., so do the cultural touchpoints that come with them: business travel, student exchanges tied to trade, collaborative tech projects. Over time, this could erode the everyday familiarity Americans once had with their neighbors. Without those constant points of contact, misunderstandings grow easier, trust erodes faster, and political gaps widen. That's the softer, slower danger of the Northern Corridor. Not the loss of goods, but the loss of connection. The clock is ticking. Washington still has options, but they're narrowing. It could pursue a reset, shelving some tariffs, investing heavily in modernizing its ports and rail, and offering a competitive digital customs system. Or it could double down on current policies, betting that the corridor will hit logistical snags. The danger of waiting? Once supply chains reroute and contractors signed, they're hard to undo. Businesses won't return to a more expensive, less predictable system just because it's politically convenient for Washington. In trade, as in life, once trust is broken, rebuilding it is slow work, and competitors rarely wait around for you to catch up.